As I begin my sermon today, I want you to picture a man traveling from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. Just picture the individual. Picture everything you can about this man. What he's wearing, his job, what he looks like, anything of those nature. If he has a family, his socioeconomic status, whatever that is, just get this picture in your mind, as much detail as you really care to have. But think about a man traveling from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. And we'll come back to that in a little bit. But as we do, we're going to talk about the concept of immigration today. And when I say that, we're going to look at what Jesus has to say, because I think it's really important, particularly when we talk about issues in our world today, that we've got to look to Jesus. We're going to say, what does Jesus say about this? How can we live the life that Jesus wants us to live? But when I think about this concept of immigration, I'm always amazed at how much, whether we're talking about the politicians or the media, try to divide us. Because when you break it down to it, no sensible person would say, let's remove all national boundaries. That's called anarchy. No, and no person who is completely has any compassionate bone in their body would say, well, we shouldn't help anybody. Right? But the media, the politicians divide us and say one side or the other, and how we separate those things. But I'm not concerned about what the politicians say. I'm not concerned what the media says. I'm concerned of what is my responsibility of a follower of Jesus Christ. That's where we have to make sure we frame the question. Because if we do anything else besides frame it about Jesus, then we have dangerous places that we can go. But I'm reminded, particularly in this issue, of the concept that worldly answers are not eternal solutions. When we think about this, we have to make sure, we can come up with the best ideas this world has ever seen, but the best ideas still don't compare to Jesus. The best ideas don't get us to that point. So we're going to look at Luke chapter 10 today. And Luke chapter 10, we're going to look at an interaction that Jesus has with some religious leaders. But as we think about this issue of immigration, I'm reminded that our world is different than it used to be. I remember exactly where I was September 11th, 2001. Most of you do. The world changed that day. All of a sudden, fear entered our world in a much more prevalent way. If you flew on an airplane before 9/11, it's a lot different now than it used to be. And maybe rightfully so. I'm not trying to say one way or another. But for whatever reason, Western civilization is living in fear because it feels as though its way of life is threatened. And we can't allow those types of fears to drive our responsibilities as a follower of Jesus Christ. We are a follower of Jesus Christ first and foremost, and we have to start there and stay there. But we're going to look at Luke chapter 10, and Jesus is interacting with the religious leader. Starting in verse 25, because one day a religious leader stood up to test Jesus with this question, asking him, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" So Jesus asked him, "What does the law say? How do you read it?" And the man answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Right, Jesus told him, "Do this, and you will live." But the man wanted to justify himself, so he asked him, "Who is my neighbor?" So let's pause there for a little bit and kind of frame this interaction that Jesus has with this expert in religious law. What's happening here? And it was common to have debates back and forth on religious ideas, on philosophical ideas, and I mean that's things we do today as well. But this was a common setting. But the man's question wasn't necessarily innocent. What must I do to inherit eternal life? And he was trying to make Jesus be pushed into a corner. Because you can think if it's just about the grace of God, then we say, well, it's cheap. If we say it's about works, then it's legalism. And so Jesus was not engaging in what the man was trying to do. He was not entering the trap. So Jesus did something that a lot of teachers, a lot of rabbis did in this time. Instead of answering the question, he asked a question. And this is a common approach in teaching, and it's a way that you help the student explore and discover the answer themselves. So Jesus asked them, well, what was the law? How do you read the law? What is that? Because Jesus didn't want to just leave this conversation to the theoretical. He wanted to dig deeper in a way that forced the concepts to be fleshed out in ways that are applicable to our lives. So the man summarizes the law. Now, this concept of summarizing the law was a common place of debate for the Jewish leaders at this point. And they had two approaches. One was to expand on the law until you were blue in the face. You know, they have commentaries, they have the Mishnah, they have the Talmud. Those are Jewish texts that expand on the law. The other approach is to make it as concise as possible, a sentence or two. And that's what the man does here. He limits the law to just a few basic concepts so that we can live out these principles. And his concepts are, love God and love others. Love is at the heart of what God commands in the Old Testament. And sometimes the Old Testament gets this legalistic, harsh rap. And there are a lot of legalistic concepts in the Old Testament. But as the man shares his understanding of what the law, the Old Testament, the book of Moses, what it's actually saying, it's that God calls us to love. So even before we get to the Gospels, even before the New Testament is written, we have this concept of the Old Testament can be summarized by God calls us to love Him and love others. But the religious leader wasn't satisfied with that. He didn't want to stop the debate. He wanted to justify himself, so he asked, who is my neighbor? Trying to define who his neighbor is. He started this conversation trying to trap Jesus or push Jesus into a corner, and he came back to doing that. By defining a neighbor meant that Jesus had to take a stance one way or another. Because if it was too broad, then the man could say, well, you don't care about God's people. If it was too narrow, well, then you don't care about God's creation. And the man was trying to trap Jesus, trying to get him to put himself in a compromising situation. Because the Jews had different expectations for how they interacted with different people. The Jews and the Gentiles were the non-Jews. The Jews interacted with each other in one way, and they interacted with Gentiles in another way. And so they had this kind of exclusive group. And we have to be careful when we get into this exclusive type mentality. And because we can do that real easily. We're here in Iowa. We're pretty far from any national border. We're pretty far from any other country influence, relatively speaking. Now, I mean, there are outside influences, don't get me wrong, but we can be removed. We can live in our own little world, our own little bubble, and say, well, those don't apply to us. And now when we think about this concept of immigration, we recognize there are different definitions that we have to have clarity in our mind. An immigrant is someone who goes from one country to another to expand their opportunities. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's good. There's a lot of immigrants that have significant resources and do it that way. There's some that scrape together every last cent they have just to be able to do that. But regardless of where you lean on the spectrum, no one would say that immigration can solve world poverty. Because you can only bring so many into a country before you run out of resources. I mean, so it's not as though we can solve world poverty by that. The actual best way sociologists tell us is to help people be raised up in their current setting, not in a way that removes our responsibility here, but from a sociological standpoint, we can't do that. Now, there's a difference between immigrant and refugee. Refugee is someone who is fleeing their home because of war, of famine, of persecution, some type of dangerous situation. And there are an estimated 25 million refugees in the world right now. That's crazy. That's hard for me to really fathom. In our country, the United States of America, it's been over 200 years since a foreign nation invaded the contiguous 48 states. we live in a pretty safe environment, and we live in the middle of that country. It's going to take people a long time to get to Iowa. We're about as safe as we can get. But I hope we don't allow our safety to remove us from what's happening in the world. And this isn't a new thing. This isn't something that just all of a sudden popped up. People fleeing for persecution, for war, for famine. That's not new. And that's why I'm reminded that worldly answers are not eternal solutions. So I'm not saying that our politicians need to get their act together. They probably do. But the politicians aren't going to be what solves the world problems. They can be avenues, they can help, they can do positive things. But there's something deeper. So Jesus is interacting with this man about who his neighbor is. So he goes on to tell the story as we continue in verse 30. He says, a man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped his clothes, beat him, and left him on the road half dead. Now let's pause there. So let's think about this context. This man was traveling on a road from Jerusalem down to Jericho. Now in this is a very particular geographical area, because from Jerusalem to Jericho, there's a 3,300-foot difference in sea level. You go down that much in 17 miles between the cities, and you go down 3,300 feet. Now, to put that in perspective, a wheelchair ramp, what they say, the regulations now, in order for that ramp to meet regulations, for every foot you go, you can rise 1 inch, so it's a 1/12th rise. From Jerusalem down to Jericho, it's a 1/27th-ish, somewhere in there. So it's just a little over twice the incline or decline of a wheelchair ramp. That's only if it goes in a straight line. But mountains, hills, rugged areas don't just go in straight lines. There's some up, there's some down, there's some curves. So it was a very rugged place with a relatively steep descent for a road that people would travel on. But not only that, it was also a place with crevices, with hiding spots, with places that people could easily sneak up on you, places that you could fall and hurt yourself. And so this man was traveling alone on this road. So as Jesus sets this story, he sets it in a way that was familiar to the people that were listening. But he also sets it up so that there would be no sympathy for this man traveling. That was foolish what he was doing. He was traveling alone on this road that was dangerous from a geographical standpoint, but it was also dangerous because bandits and thieves would commonly hide there, would take advantage of those who were traveling along the road, and everybody knew it. It's like walking in a dark alley at midnight. We know better. We don't do those types of things on our own. This man did things on his own. He was alone. He got mugged. Well, what else did he expect? That's probably what the listeners were thinking when they thought about this man doing this. He got what he deserved. He should have known better. Now, I asked you earlier if you could think of a man traveling from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. And the reason I did that is because Jesus does not define this traveler. He is talking to the religious leaders, to a Jewish audience. So it's likely that the people Jesus was talking to thought of somebody like themselves. Thought if it was a Jewish person traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho. And in part, that would make sense because they're in Israel. They're in a place where a lot of Jews actually live. But the Gospel of Luke was not written to Jews. It's actually written to Gentiles, to non-Jews. So it's likely that Luke's audience would probably be thinking of someone who was not a Jew making this trip. The point of what I'm trying to make is that this traveler could be somebody like you. Now, Jesus defines this person as a male, and so that's why I said a man traveling from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. But it's likely that if you actually thought about that traveler, that person from Washington, D.C. to Chicago, you probably had similarities with that person. Something that you shared in common, something that was relatable. I doubt you picked somebody that was completely opposite of you in every way, shape, or form. something similar, because this traveler could represent you, represents us as individuals. And this traveler was beaten. He was mugged by bandits. And bandits are very different than thieves. Thieves just steal and go on their merry way. Bandits actually will kill, will destroy, will hurt. That's part of their intent, and that is what this man encountered. He didn't encounter people that just wanted to steal. He encountered people that wanted to hurt him. Well, Jesus continues, and he says, by chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed by. Now, the priest is somebody who is a clergy person, somebody who cares for the temple, would do all the regulations, the sacrifices, would meet with people, would just tend to the normal religious responsibilities of the day. Now, it's interesting to note, this is the only time that Jesus has any negative thing to say about priests. So in general, there's a concept that priests do good things. They do what's right. They fulfill their responsibility. But in this story that is hypothetical, Jesus doesn't speak well about the priests. As the priests, as I said, cared for the temple responsibilities. And there are several reasons as to why the priest did not help this traveler, this man lying on the side of the ground. And one of the reasons may be the man was half dead, that he wasn't doing well. And the priest saw that he was dying and just didn't want to get involved. And part of the issue is that if a priest comes in contact with someone who is dead, then that priest would be ceremonially unclean for 7 days and would not be able to fulfill the responsibilities in the temple. Now, for us, that seems a little foreign. But make sure you don't remove yourself from the situation, because we come up with all sorts of excuses to why we don't do things. Well, I don't have time right now, or I've got this responsibility. I got to do these things, so I can't tend to this situation. Well, the priest was so busy with his religious responsibilities that he said, well, I can't deal with this. I can't help this person. So he gave himself a pass, moved on, and went on his merry way, ignoring this person who was suffering. Well, then a Levite came by, as Jesus continues. It said the Levite went over and looked at the man, but he too crossed the other side and passed by. Now, the Levite is kind of like a temple assistant. There's more, for all intents and purposes, it's another clergy person for the temple in the Jewish world at this time. But the Levite did something a little different than the priest. The priest saw the man and then crossed. The Levite went over and looked at the man. But he decided to keep going. And one of the reasons the Levite may have decided not to help this man was because one of the ploys that bandits and thieves would do at this time is they put a decoy out. As I said, there were a lot of rocks, a lot of crevices, a lot of hiding spots. And so they could put somebody like this man that was half dead and put him on the ground so that somebody would come over and help him. And when that person came over and helped them, then the thieves and bandits would jump out and mug that person too. So the Levite looked over and said, it's not worth the risk. This man was traveling alone, remember? We don't have any sympathy for him. He got what he deserved. Why should we help him? So I'm going to keep going. I'm not going to put myself in harm's way for this man who made a mistake, and he should have known better. So he kept going. Now at this point, everything is pretty predictable in Jesus' story. The listeners to what Jesus was saying said, okay, yeah, things come in threes in Jewish stories. The first person didn't help. We expect that. Second person didn't help. We expect that. Well, the third person is going to help. The third person is going to be the hero of the story. Now, the Jews at the time would have expected that Jesus, the third person he mentioned, would have been just a normal Israelite, a normal Jew, a normal person who was trying to do their best to follow Jesus. Not Jesus at that time, but follow God. Because they would have had this kind of anti-clergy leading. Not that it was super negative, but that the regular Jewish follower of God would do what the religious leaders weren't willing to do. Well, that's not where Jesus goes. He continues in verse 33. He says, "Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to the man, he soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn where he cared for him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, 'Take care of this man, and if his bill runs higher, I'll pay it the next time I'm here.'" This is probably not real mind-blowing for us. This is the parable of the Good Samaritan. Even non-church people have a concept of the Good Samaritan, of somebody who will help somebody else. But for the Jewish audience at this time, this was mind-blowing. This was really out of their comfort zone. Because in part, the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along at all. They just did not like each other one bit. In fact, if a Jew was traveling and the quickest route was to go through Samaria, the Jew would go around. So picture for a moment, we're in Iowa right here. I know some of you are from Illinois, but just bear with me for the moment here. Picture traveling from Iowa to Indiana in a car while avoiding Illinois. That's what they would do. They would go around. And really, there's no good way to get from Indiana to Iowa without going through Illinois. There's no good way. But they would inconvenience themselves that much because they hated the Samaritans that much. They didn't want to interact with them. They didn't want to be associated with them. They felt the Samaritans had just really degraded their faith and had gone completely away. They were just not even half-breeds. They were just, they were icky. We don't associate with these people. That's how much the Jews did not like the Samaritans. So Jesus is talking to this Jewish audience with the Samaritan being the hero of the story, and they are getting uncomfortable. They're not real excited about this. Because the Samaritan does things that the religious leaders wouldn't do, that the Levite and the priest, that they would not do. He breaks the trend, and he's the hero of the story. And in this, Jesus shatters all race, all region, all religious, all socioeconomic expectations. He says, get those out of your mind. Those don't matter. You may hate the Samaritans. They may be the scum of the earth, but they're still created in the image of God. They're still individual people that we need to care for. And even those Samaritans, maybe they hurt themselves. Maybe their pain is self-inflicted, but Jesus said, I don't care. That's not the point. The Samaritan in this story, he had reason not to help this man. Now, Jesus does not define the man. The Jewish audience probably would have assumed this man was a Jew. And so the Samaritan said, I don't want to help a Jew. But the traveler, the mugged man, was undefined. It could be anybody and anywhere and any time. The Samaritan had a reason not to help the man because it was dangerous. That the man was half dead. There was no guarantee that he was actually going to have any productive thing come from helping this man. He could have helped him for half an hour, and the man could have died. And, well, what good did that do? He took a risk. It cost him a lot. As I said, there was the risk of the potential other bandits coming out to harm him. There was the cost of the money that he had to spend to help take care of this man. There was the cost of the wine and the oil, and those were very practical things. The wine would clean the wound, while the olive oil would actually help heal the wound. So he didn't just have sympathy for the man, he gave practical help for the man. Jesus doesn't call us just to feel sorry for people and stop there. He calls us to have practical help for others, even if their pain is self-inflicted. Because what Jesus is trying to get us to understand is that worldly answers are not eternal solutions. Just because the man got what he deserved doesn't mean we stop there. Now, when you think about the man putting the traveler on his own donkey, and he's taking him to an inn, caring for him, and paying the innkeeper to care for him. I mean, that was pretty extensive. This is a pretty extreme case scenario. Most of us, at least knowingly, don't encounter these types of experiences every day. But as I said, it costs the Samaritan something. So the 2 coins, the version I read had said 2 silver coins. Some of your versions may say 2 denarii. Essentially, it's 2 days' wages. And when we break that down today, let's say you make $20 an hour, you work 8 hours a day, that's $320 for 2 days, which is a lot of money. I don't have $320 I just want to give away just randomly. But most people in our country have a discretionary amount of $300 that they could spend if they wanted to. Now, we tend to spend it on other things that maybe aren't as necessary as we would like them to be. I mean, did I need this phone? Did I need a tablet today? See, we have discretionary money, and Jesus says we can't use these things just for our own personal gain, our own personal benefit. We have resources. We have things at our disposal, and maybe you don't have $300 today. Maybe that is an insurmountable amount to you, but you have something. You have care that you can give. You have resources at your disposal. You have talents and gifts that you can help others with. So Jesus says, even if you encounter people whose wounds are self-inflicted, we're still to have compassion on them. But not just sympathy, practical help for them as well. Now, as I think about the Samaritan, one of the things that sticks out to me about this man, about the Samaritan, is the fact on the outside, he didn't look very godlike. He was a Samaritan. And the implication that Jesus is trying to impose on him is he's somebody who kind of knows what God is about, but really doesn't. Kind of does his own thing, is trying to break away from others. So on the outside, the Samaritan looked like a heretic, but he sure looked like he had the love of God inside of him. He looked like his heart was different than the heart of the priest and the heart of the Levite. That's hard for us to sometimes fathom, because we're fighting these political battles, and these people are wanting to do this, that, or the other, and we're saying, no, we want to do this, that, or that. We can't do this, and so we look like the people that don't have the love of Jesus in our heart. And I think we got to be real careful, because too many times we try to fight political battles claiming that we're fighting for Jesus, when we're really just proclaiming our political ideology. And there's nothing wrong with a political philosophy. I'm not trying to say you can't have one. I've got one. It's probably better than yours. But see, that's what happens with our political philosophies. But Jesus finishes this interaction with the religious leader, and he says, now which of these 3, the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan, would you say was a neighbor to the man who was mugged and beaten by the bandits? And the expert in religious law said to Jesus, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. Now remember, the premise of this conversation was, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And then we get to, what does the law expect us but love God, love people? Then, who is my neighbor? Well, Jesus tells a story about who my neighbor is, and he says, now do this. This is what you are to do. He shows what it means to be a neighbor, because Jesus calls us to be active participants in his kingdom. But don't miss the point that the religious leader will not explicitly say that the Samaritan is the hero of the story. He's just the one who had mercy. He doesn't want to say the Samaritan is the one we should follow. Now, granted, this is a hypothetical story. Jesus is telling a parable. Now, there may be some truth to what Jesus is sharing, but he doesn't claim this is a factual event. But the one who showed mercy is the one who Jesus says, emulate that person. Be like that individual. And so in this, Jesus defines neighbor actively. Neighbor is not just somebody that's next, that is like you. See, the Jews would have defined neighbor as another Jew. But neighbor is the person that you encounter, the people that you can influence, the people that you can affect. That is your neighbor, the person that you don't even like but you see every day. Your coworker, the person at the restaurant, the person at the grocery store, your neighbor. Maybe you have a family member that you see more often than you would like. Those are your neighbors, and Jesus says we need to treat them like the Samaritan treats the man who was mugged. Now, there's an Arab proverb that I think we can all agree with, or at least have heard this concept before. It says, to be a good neighbor, you must first be one. Now, that's not necessarily what Jesus said, but I think the concept has validity for us. That we can be real tempted to follow what the priest or the Levite did. The Levite said, I don't want to take the risk. I'm going to live in my own little bubble. I don't want to put myself in a dangerous position. And the priest said, you know what? I've got other responsibilities that are more important than this over here, so I'm not going to take care of this person who has self-inflicted wounds, who should have known better. We can have those excuses. And I'm sure there's a myriad of other excuses that we can give. But when we think about this concept of immigration, we have to make sure that we separate our political philosophies from our religious expectations, from our responsibility as a follower of Jesus. We have to make sure we separate those two. Because you can have a political philosophy. I'm not trying to downgrade that. I do find it real interesting that when you break down what one side or the other does, there's not really that much difference. Because when one administration gets called out for what they do, well, that's what the other administration did. You know, because people are trying to divide us. People are trying to get us off sorts. But a couple of questions I have been thinking of, you know, maybe this is not the appropriate place to do that. Maybe this confronts a reality. But one of the questions I had is, if my government wants to spend money helping other people in the world, why would it, as a follower of Jesus, would I get in the way of that? Now, I'm not saying that our government should or shouldn't do that, but why am I fighting against that? But at the same point, I'm asking, why do we spend so much time as followers of Jesus fighting against things instead of fighting for things? I think that lies at the heart of what we tend to do sometimes. Now, I also am concerned, as we live in a very comfortable, very safe environment, relatively speaking, from a global standpoint. I don't know if we have come to the terms that if I die serving Jesus, that's okay. Western civilization is threatened, and so we're hiding. We're removing ourselves. We're saying, no. But you know what? If I die being Jesus to somebody else, if I die because I'm being Jesus to somebody else, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I understand that's real easy to say in Iowa. We live pretty far removed from any border crisis. We live pretty far removed from any refugee situation. I'm talking about what Jesus is telling us to do is to be neighbors. And to be a neighbor means we actively work to be Jesus to others. The world is looking for answers, but those answers the world has are not eternal solutions. But Jesus has them. Now we have to be careful. We can hide behind that statement. Well, the answer is Jesus. It's not our government. We can hide behind that statement and look pretty self-righteous when we do that. Because those who don't know Jesus says, man, you're just full of yourself. We need to be active participants in this kingdom that Jesus has ushered in, and in that we can build his kingdom and help others to see this hope, this healing, this redemptive power of Jesus.